Hey there. This is one of those episodes where I'm going to do a warning at the beginning that it's a bit atypical than the usual broken silicon. I did a warning like this, for example, before the Dave Eggleston episode where I said that you should know it's going to be a more technical discussion as usual, but I thought it was an important one, and if you enjoy broken silicon, you would probably enjoy it even if some of it went over your head. Well, this time the warning is that it gets a bit more political than usual, and that's unavoidable. The fact of the matter is, at Broken Silicon, at Moore's Law is Dead, we try to stay away from politics unless it's necessary to be part of the conversation. And the fact is, it is. Politics and what's going on in world events right now is part of a reason you can't buy the toys you want. Okay? That's the thing. This channel was ahead of reporting that, for example, Zen 2 was going to be a big deal, Zen 3 was going to be a big deal, that RDNA 2 was going to be a big deal, that AMD was resurgent, and that if you were a future buyer, you had to know that you needed to pay attention to them. We were also, on the forefront of talking about the price manipulation going on at NVIDIA before it came out, that Ampere is not going to cost remotely what they said it would, and then eventually talking about the shortages and what's causing them. Well, that's what we talk about a lot here. Shortages on tons of products that rely on TSMC in Taiwan. And so whether it's from a conflict over the island or from something like an earthquake, this is a non-zero chance of happening. There could be a shortage, and there's various reasons it could be caused and various outcomes and realities of what you would have to deal with. So that's what me and Jason Fields, who's really an esteemed reporter here, who's been managing editor at Reuters, this is a real deal. So anytime politics enters into this conversation, anytime we're talking about world events, it's from the perspective of discussing what it would mean for you. That's why we did this episode. So this is the warning that this is an atypical episode, but it involves the products you're trying to buy. And so I hope you enjoy it. Yeah, that's enough of a warning, I think. I think this is one of the better ones either way. Enjoy the show. The following podcast is brought to you by eWin Gaming Chairs. Use offer code Broken Silicon to get 20% off these practical and comfortable products that Moore's Law is Dead actually uses, and also use this offer code at cdkeyoffers.com for 30% off Windows keys and die shrink for 3% off every other key on the website. Now, on with the show. And welcome to Broken Silicon, a typically gaming hardware podcast. I am your host, Tom, and just right at the top, I'm going to let my guest introduce himself.
Hi, well, my name is Jason Fields. I've been a journalist for 26 years. I am, in fact, older than your parents. But I also am the host of the Angry Planet podcast, which we created 6 years ago when we were at Reuters. And the Angry Planet Angry Planet podcast deals with conflicts all over the world and all different types.
I've been a fan of, well, it used to be called War College. That's what I remember it as since before I actually even started Moore's Law is Dead and Broken Silicon. And looking back on it, I'll go a few months and then I'll there's been a few episodes I haven't listened to. I'll listen to a few in a row of Angry Planet. I've been starting to realize that it really feels like your podcast is almost a military, logistical, and political version of Broken Silicon. It's a lot less of the typical, ooh, look at this new fighter jet or what's happening in this one battle. You guys will discuss something like, what is the supply chain to even keep a fighter jet running? That one battle happened. What causes these types of battles to happen in the first place? And typically on Broken Silicon, we talk about how the gaming hardware is actually made, why there are shortages or not. Yours is kind of a war version of Broken Silicon in my eyes. It's really interesting. I really can't recommend it enough to people listening.
Well, thank you. And that's actually really flattering, but I'll take it. Happy to take it.
Well, unlike Broken Silicon, Angry Planet certainly isn't afraid to stay away from politics. I mean, it's unavoidable if you're involving war, really. On Broken Silicon, we try to not bring it up unless absolutely necessary. But well, a reason I wanted to do this episode today is I feel like a lot of YouTube channels involving gaming or really anything that tries to be lighthearted, let's say, are entering into a point of absurdity in how much they're avoiding politics. Like you'll see some of these YouTubers talk about like graphics card prices and why you can't get a hold of a PlayStation 5. And then they try to explain it while not getting into politics or what's going on with a lot of controversial issues all over the world right now. And it's like, guys, those issues are causing you to not buy your toy. I'm sorry, but we have to talk about politics. And that's why it occurred to me like this might be a unique chance to talk to a more political, centered, have a more political conversation that is literally connected to gaming right now. And so I want to ask, are you aware of, like, I'm sure you're aware of the shortages. We already talked a little before we started recording, but like how bad it's really gotten for like gaming hardware. Like, I'll just tell you, like, there's a lot of anger in gaming circles right now.
I'm not at all surprised. I mean, my intention when the latest Xbox came out and also PlayStation 5 was to actually buy both because I like to play with these things. And I've gotten my hands on neither.
Yeah.
I refuse to pay the premium. And as a result, I mean, I just haven't been lucky enough to walk into the right store or find it for sale online. I mean, it's probably a shortcoming of mine. But anyway, that just says to me, this is ridiculous. I've watched these shortages before, like when the first, Nintendo, like when the Wii came out, for example, and there were forced shortages and you couldn't get it for months and all that. But I mean, this does not seem like that at all. I mean, what's it been, a year now?
Yeah, and I think a few weeks will be literally a year since, I don't remember the exact date, the Xbox and the PlayStation came out. And they're still unavailable. I mean, frankly, just to give you some advice, if you want to get it, the store is not the way to go, I don't think. I think you got to just kind of hound PlayStation's websites, Amazon, Target, and Walmart. I just think most people aren't willing to do that because we have lives. And it is very frustrating, if you're not willing to go, oh, they're going to have a drop at 4 a.m. at Walmart.com. I'll just be ready to click. They made more PlayStation 5s than they made PlayStation 4s in the first year. So I don't know. A lot of it's demand, I believe, but also a lot of it, at least in the gaming PC space, is, oh God, I mean, I don't even know where to get into it, right? I've done so many articles on it, but it's like, hoarding, shipping issues caused by various political reasons, including how COVID's being handled between different countries. And I guess it's made me realize that because this has happened to PC gaming before where graphics cards have become twice as expensive, but I don't think it was ever this bad. It's made me realize just if people are this mad now at shortages, I mean, it could get a lot worse depending on what happens geopolitically around the world. Do you feel like people are sleeping on? I mean, people forget there were like victory gardens during World War II and stuff like that. I mean, do you think people are maybe sleeping on how much worse the shortages could get, that COVID really isn't anything compared to what other things that could happen?
Oh, you're totally right, I think. When you have, everything made overseas, and anything that's made entirely outside of your country, you're at the mercy of someone. You just are, by definition. Same, actually, if you were at the mercy of a single company. It's actually, in some ways, it's not that different from being at the mercy of a monopoly, because then you're stuck with whatever price they want to charge you. But in this case, yeah, I mean, it's something that we barely make in the United States. Although that's changing, right? I mean, they are trying to build factories to bring semiconductors back to the United States. But I mean, there's no way that's going to happen in a, super fast time.
And even if they are, that's like going to be like 10%, 20% of the factories in the world. So
you're totally right. So who are we reliant on more than anybody else? Taiwan.
Mhm. They make the PlayStation, the Xbox, and the graphics cards you want to buy.
Yeah. And Taiwan, as you guys have probably been hearing, is, well, it's the site of a lot of tension right now.
I actually kind of want to start backing up a little bit and
Hmm.
go. I feel like we need to mention briefly here that the West, Nixon clearly thought if we brought capitalism to China, that they would just become more like us. And in some ways they have, I guess. But do you believe this was all successful after we've seen Tibet fall, Hong Kong fall? Hong Kong, a lot of people thought wouldn't. It is for anyone listening. Like, I don't want to get into a debate that makes people mad to hear that. China controls Taiwan. I mean, Hong Kong completely now. There's really no
Hmm.
debate about that. And yet I still see people going, I don't know that China would ever try to take Taiwan. It's like, well, we're 2 out of 3 so far. I think they're going to. I mean, do you believe we were at all successful in making China more amenable to us through bringing capitalism to them? And then again, like, how do you feel like this affects their ambitions towards Taiwan? And there's so much I could start with, but yeah.
Sure. Well, yeah, going back to Nixon, we finally, you got to think, like, the reality on the ground was in 1949, 1950, the communists took over China.
Hmm.
There was no debate about it. The nationalist government, the anti-communists, fled. They fled to an island off the coast of China. That island is Taiwan. And
Yeah.
that's where that they still see themselves, the people of Taiwan, the government of Taiwan, as being the legitimate government of China, which is, try to wrap your brain around that. You're talking about like 23 million people versus 1.4 billion people.
Yeah.
But what happened for us was we just said, no, we're going to continue to recognize the losers for more
Hmm.
than 20 years. We didn't have diplomatic relations with the actual China part of China. Um, and then Nixon went in and realized, hey, you know what? Maybe it makes more sense to acknowledge reality.
Hmm.
We switched our diplomatic recognition to China. We do not have a diplomatic relationship strictly with Taiwan. That's
Not
another thing that's kind of
acknowledged, but
interesting.
like we do, but it's
No,
not acknowledged.
absolutely. But we don't have an ambassador there.
Hmm.
An ambassador is something that you have to a country. This is not a country. I mean that's the kind of
Yeah.
crazy fiction that's going on. I mean, you have to understand it's all like diplomatic fiction. Um, and China, the People's Republic, the big guy, has felt like Taiwan is a runaway province. They feel like there is no Taiwan per se. There is no government of Taiwan that's legitimate. They are completely illegitimate. And therefore, the Chinese are just taking their time. And at any moment, they could just, as far as they're concerned, legally invade Taiwan.
Hmm.
And they wouldn't even call it an invasion. That's not what it is, according to this fictional world. You know what
Well,
I mean?
see, it is like just switching between fictional worlds and La La Lands, in my opinion. Like, we pretend China isn't real, then we pretend Taiwan isn't real, even though they have their own passports and like they are. And then now recently, I feel like the new La La Land is pretending China's not gonna try to take back Taiwan, because it's funny that you talk about we don't have an ambassador to Taiwan, and they see it as a runaway province. I find that kind of insane that they consider it a runaway province. I've been paying that much attention to Taiwan until a few years ago. And I'll tell you, when I was in college and I just thought of Taiwan as its own country and didn't even realize, 10 years ago that China really still had ambitions. But the more I look at it, they really see it differently than the way we do. And I think most people in the West know Taiwan's its own country. But that is not how China sees it. And yet I see a lot of leaders and people making big decisions on the world stage, whether at a company or, as the leader of a government, operating, I feel like, unaware of just how much China really still does see Taiwan as part of its country, even though there's really no evidence it is at all. They have their own passports, they have their own military. It is not. right? Would
Yeah.
you? I don't know if you want to speak to that at all.
No, I think you're right. I mean, but there's also there's a reason for it as well. Um, the United States has a stated policy called strategic ambiguity
Yeah.
with Taiwan, which is fantastic. What we say is we might come to their aid if China decides to invade. You just never know. Honestly, it really is that. We will
hmm
not commit to it, but we hint at being Taiwan's full-fledged ally. And we also say, well, we won't do that. We actually have both in mind, and we are saying both at the same time. It's really, really weird.
Well,
Uh,
does this remind you at all of like pre-World War One, where underneath the table everyone had these treaties they really were going to commit to, but in public it's a little different because it was more publicly stated, but I still feel like in public before World War One, a lot of countries were like, are they really going to team up against each other? Are they really going to let this big war break out? We're going to say that we would probably defend this group. We would probably go to war and support France in this way. And then a domino fell, and it's like, no, we are going. It's like, well, you kind of made it out like you weren't going to. You kind of made it out like it was all posturing. Now we know it's not posturing, and we're in a bigger, longer war than we ever intended. I really get that feeling about what's going on with Taiwan right now, and it actually frightens me quite a bit.
I think that's interesting. I think it also is interesting to think about it expressly in the US context, because the US context is we were friends with England, but we never committed to defend them. And in fact, when you think about it, was only when US shipping was being sunk at a pretty high rate
Yeah,
as we were,
right.
I mean, because we were, again, as you just like what you said, under the table, we were supplying
Before World
weapons.
War One and during, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and but we didn't actually get involved. U.S. troops didn't get involved until the very end, coming in on the Allied side. Actually, U.S. troops got there. I don't know if people realize this, months before
hmm
the war ended.
Yeah, I know.
Not years, months. So it's a very interesting, thing. But I wonder if we wouldn't be in a similar situation like what you're saying with Taiwan. I mean, where I think, we might not come in until it's too late.
hmm
I mean, I'm not saying that we wouldn't come into it, but would we actually be there in a way that would be helpful to the Taiwanese?
And you bring up shipping, that's what really did it.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm going to bring in one of the reader mails here from one of our listeners here. Type 2501 writes, and he says, hi, Tom, and our guest, Jason. To be honest, I was a bit surprised when we have a conversation about Taiwan and her geopolitical situation in a gaming hardware podcast, because I've spent 5 years of my life in Taiwan and have good friends there. Here's a little episode I came across in central Taiwan when I was there. One night I was driving from my friend's place to Yakiniki, a Japanese grill, for dinner, and I was shocked when we drove past a TSMC gigafab, a microfab, a Nanya fab, the fourth largest DRAM maker in the world, for those who don't know, HQ of AUO, and a Corning glass factory within our 30-minute city drive. We always knew the importance of Taiwan in a global sense for the electronic supply chain, but in this 30-minute drive, I distinctly remember this in my life, being amazed just how much industry is there. So that is where I go, I don't know. I feel like this diplomatic ambiguity that's going on right now is currently, it seems like, at least they're acting like it's seen by China as that ambiguity. When you hear this 30-minute drive, you just half of the stuff we need for everything they drove past accidentally. I don't know that there's any ambiguity in the fact that we need Taiwan in the West. And when I ask people like Daniel Nenny, who's been a long-term veteran of the silicon industry and was been on the podcast multiple times. I mean, he founded semiwiki.com. I mean, I asked him what would happen if they invaded Taiwan, and he's like, oh, a war. And everyone I ask, who's high up at silicon companies is like, well, China wouldn't do that because we would fight a world war over Taiwan. And I'm like, I don't know if China knows that. I mean, I don't know if you want to speak to any of that at all, like the importance of Taiwan. Like,
Yeah, no, I agree.
could we get involved too late? Because I'm not so sure we could.
Okay, so a couple of things to sort of unpack that. Taiwan is, as you say, of critical importance. It creates and builds things that everybody needs. But it's not just the West that needs them. China needs them.
Yeah.
And China actually has very limited semiconductor manufacturing capacity. I think people would assume that China, it makes everything, it's where your iPhone's from, that China is actually, making all this stuff for themselves. And they're not. And the problem isn't so much that they're getting everything from Taiwan, but you take Taiwan out of the equation, and there's just a greater shortage around the world. Plus, you'd have sanctions. I mean, forget about a war. We don't know about the war, honestly. And I think that's a real thing we don't know. But the sanctions are very real because they're easy to do and relatively cheap. This would cost China so much that it wouldn't just be a one-way thing. It wouldn't just be Taiwan that would be in pain. China would genuinely, there are reasons for China not to do this.
So I don't know if I put it on the script, but I know there was a reader mail question about that. Like, you can imagine who our allies would be: South Korea, Japan, who actually has quite a more capable military than most people realize right now. Most people don't realize they actually have one of the strongest militaries in the world, relatively speaking, to how small a lot of European countries have gotten. And then, Australia would be on our side, so on and so forth. Like, who would be on China's side? I mean, North Korea, if they really wanted to be, I guess. And now you're saying maybe. Like, isn't Pakistan technically an ally of ours, even though I almost laugh saying they're our ally? It's like,
yeah.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
No, they are actually an ally of both.
So do you think they would, who do you think would actually come to the aid of China? I guess maybe North Korea is crazy enough, but.
Yeah, actually, no, you're right. One of the things that, despite what's happened over the last few years, and I'll save, let's just say I'll avoid getting that political.
Thank you.
Yes, but the U.S. does have friends. The U.S. is really the only country that has military bases all over the world. Russia has one military base outside of Russia, and that's in Syria. China also doesn't have an extensive system of allies where they have military bases either. So I believe they put one in, you're going to love this, I love saying this word, Djibouti. So, I mean, talk about obscure and so you're right. It does seem like maybe they would stand alone. But boy, they're big in so many different ways. They have such a large military. And as far as their spending on their military goes and their modernization of the military, I don't think that's even been reported enough. They hide a significant part of their budget, and it's still hundreds of billions of dollars.
I wouldn't be one of the people that would make the argument that their military is negligible compared to ours. Now, don't get me wrong, and maybe it's just because I'm an American, but I do think our military dwarfs theirs in capabilities overall. But I do think that an actual engagement would be catastrophically bad, and that people underestimate, especially the closer you get to their mainland, how capable it probably is.
I think that's such a good point, because what we've talked about on Angry Planet and what you've seen in the news is actually that it's possible China could deny the United States access to and possibly success in areas nearby China. If they ended up fighting against Taiwan, if they end up fighting against Vietnam. I mean, the South China Sea is also another conflict that I don't think we'll get into today, but that actually involves Vietnam and a lot of other countries in that region.
Not to get off subject, but I think people would be surprised to hear that Vietnam, I think, would be more likely on our side than theirs.
Totally right.
Based on people I talk to that live in Vietnam, they really aren't friends of China at all.
No, they fought a nasty war.
Yeah. Yeah, that
So
was weird with Vietnam. They just, man, they had to fight the French, then us, then China. It's just everyone had to take a turn and they won each time. So good for them, you know.
yeah,
But people forget that the last one to fight them was China, and
yeah,
Vietnam remembers that.
yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, China's really quite powerful. They can't project their power in the same way the United States can, so far from their shores. But yeah, they're very confident. Um,
Gosh, Reese, why does Windows 10 Professional have to be so expensive? Don't listen to that, nerd. Listen to me. You can get all the great Windows and gaming keys you need at cdkeyoffers.com. That includes Steam, Origin, Uplay, PlayStation, PC, and many other keys, including Windows, Microsoft Word, and Professional. Use the offer code BrokenSilicon for 30% off all Windows keys, and these can be upgraded to Windows 11, and also use the offer code DOSHRINK for everything else on the website. Now, back to the show. Well, so then let me get into this. I've got a few reader mails here. It's hard for me to know which one to start with, but like we got yours truly, Johnny Dollar is his name. It's asking like, what would an invasion look like? And then Aiden Maltby asks, if a war broke out, what are the chances TSMC survive? Because I feel like, if I can jump in here, any attempted takeover of Taiwan, I feel like Russia came up with the blueprint with Crimea. I mean, there you go. Find an excuse, have little green men show up. Am I wrong? That's probably what they would do first. Or do you think there'd be some other likely scenario that would start something over Taiwan?
well, I think they're kind of two different questions. But I do think that the little green men issue, you've got a problem with it working. You don't have a land
Okay.
border. How would you get the little green men there without people noticing?
Mm-hmm.
That would be my main thought about that. But as far as the infrastructure and the chip manufacturers and everything else that's in Taiwan, you could be sure whatever campaign China would launch, they would avoid hitting those like the plague. They want to take that intact. That's really important stuff. They then can deny us chips entirely. They have a constant supply for themselves. It's a huge advantage to them to not destroy the infrastructure of Taiwan.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like if anything came to a head, to me, it sounds like it would be some sort of them attempting a blockade. Am I wrong? Like, that's probably what it would be then. They're not going to get little green men there. The idea for the little green men thing I had was, what if a natural disaster happened and then they're like, oh, well, we'll just, you're part of our country, so let us just bring in the military to help clean everything up. And, well, we need to take control of the airport so we can land people here. And then a year later, I think we're going to leave them in the airport. That's
That's not a bad idea.
That's my suspicion for what China's waiting for. They're just waiting for any excuse to say, hey, we'll pay for all of it. Just let us land at the airport.
Well, I love that idea, and I think the Chinese, who are clearly listening into the show, love that idea. Thanks for giving all the good ideas to the enemy, but we're not technically enemies anyway.
I'm sure they've got like 10 options on the table that they've thought of 5 years ago, but I can't. But that is what I would do. I'd be like, we need to wait for any excuse to give them a ton of money for free and land people at the airport.
Yeah, you're totally right. No, I mean, I like that idea a lot. I'm just in terms of intelligence, the intelligence of it. Yeah, well, one thing is for sure, though, you can't trust promises. I think that actually gets to what could happen in Taiwan. It's also, I think it's worth mentioning Hong Kong again, briefly, because Hong Kong was given back by the British to China in 1997. In a deal that said China would not put its hands on Hong Kong in any really meaningful way for 50 years.
And is that, I don't mean to be pedantic, but is that literally like, do you know off the top of your head, like what did literally the treaty say? Because this is the problem with ambiguity. When you put a treaty and say you can't, like, I'm sure this wasn't how it was worded, but if it was basically worded like you can't really take it, what does really mean?
No, it actually guaranteed a free press.
Okay.
Freedom of assembly. Basically, a lot of the things.
Well, that's
independent
gone,
judiciary.
so.
Yeah, an independent judiciary.
Oh, that's gone.
some form of a local elected legislature. So no, it was pretty specific, and
Oh,
actually wouldn't seem that alien to us. Like, so that a person living in America, living in that hypothetical Taiwan, would actually be pretty happy and feel like they were living in a free society.
or Hong Kong.
Yes. Sorry, man. But
No,
yeah.
I knew what you meant. But yeah, and I already, yeah, so didn't they do something with legislatures where they like now you have to go to a mainland China judge at a certain point. There was some,
Hmm.
so that's just gone then.
Yeah,
I
that's
mean,
just
it's
gone.
not even a question. And we
No,
and who was supposed to guarantee that happened? England?
I think that's exactly the problem. No
Mm,
one really guaranteed it. It was a one-sided agreement. China made that agreement, but yeah, there's no way to enforce it. But uh, doesn't that seem interesting, though? I mean, it's like no one really made much of a fuss. There were
mhm.
no substantial sanctions against China. People just said, boy, that's a shame.
I honestly, that's what I said. I was like, well, that's too bad, you know.
Well, you know, I just wonder if the world might not have that same response to Taiwan. I mean, it's
Exactly. And this is where I think a mistake could happen, a miscalculation from both sides. I think that no matter what we say in terms of ambiguity, bringing it back to the World War One reference, I think the West is sure we would do something about Taiwan. And I think on the Chinese side, they look at Hong Kong and they go, well, that worked, so should work here. Um, I assume they actually know we'd care more, but I don't think, I just think either you care or you don't. And it turns out we didn't care about Hong Kong, but we do about Taiwan.
well, I mean, I think that makes perfect sense. I don't know if it's true. And
Mm,
I'm still really hoping we're not going to find out for a little while. Um, but it does seem like, okay, so I wrote a column
hmm
just a couple of weeks ago, which asked the question when China will invade Taiwan. And the answer I came to is whenever the hell it damn well pleases. And the reasoning for that is that China acts because of its own internal motivations. China takes aggressive action and outward action when it needs to make an impression on its own population,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
Yeah. A lot of it has to do with making an example to its people half the time.
yeah, and an example, but also, they've built this nationalist frenzy in China that I think it's kind of hard for the United States to understand. I
Hmm
mean, we have, very strong patriotism, but we're also not hit with messages every single day, telling you exactly how great, Xi Jinping is, or Jinping, sorry. You're not hit every minute with an exhortation to serve the motherland. I mean,
hmm
man, these people are being brainwashed every single day. It's so if Xi needs a little bit of a boost, things aren't going so well, GDP falls, Evergrande goes out of business.
hmm
What does he do? He may concentrate that nationalism and point it outwards, give an external enemy. And my thought is when he needs that, Taiwan may be just the place to go.
Right. And China has a tendency to intelligently take its time with any policies. It doesn't need to happen tomorrow. We're just going to make sure when the time is right, we really seize on the opportunity. And that's where I feel like they are just waiting a decade. And they know within that decade, there's a good chance there's some disaster that happens in Taiwan. And
Mm-hmm.
if that happens, like you're saying, around a international depression that could happen, which I don't think is a crazy idea at all. They like if there's an economic downturn and then at the same time that happens, I really think they're just waiting for the stars to align. But they know that if they're willing to wait 20 years, it'll probably happen at some point in that. And
Mm-hmm.
that's when they come together. The question is them. Let's just to frame it this way: a tsunami, some tidal wave hits Taiwan. It's not really that bad, but China says we're going to give you $1 trillion to build up, like just an
Mm-hmm.
outrageous amount. Like We're just going to show up, pay for everything, and we're going to land at the airport. Do you think Taiwan says no? Do you think the U.S. jumps in and says we can't let them show up?
No, I actually think that it would have to be a pretty bad natural disaster. But I would say that Taiwan actually gets hit by a lot of earthquakes, for example.
Okay, so an earthquake.
It's on a nasty fault line. So you can imagine, bad enough earthquake put together with a large enough typhoon. It's not like these horrible things don't happen coming together in horrible ways. It really does happen like that. And with the storms getting progressively worse and more common with climate change, then I think you're also dealing with, I don't think
I
you're
think the
crazy.
earthquake one's a good example, though.
Crazy.
I think the earthquake one's an even better example than a tidal wave because water you can clean up, but not to sound like an idiot, but run with me here. Earthquakes are way worse for sensitive manufacturing machines. Earthquakes are a way worse situation, I would imagine. And it would have to be a horrible tidal wave to even compare to, or a hurricane to compare to what an earthquake could, I think, much more easily do to this delicate machinery. So you could make the argument that China could make the argument themselves. We're not going to take no for an answer. We need the chips just as much as you guys. So we're showing up to fix this as soon as possible. And I think they would have a legitimate claim, too. The International World Court would say, well,
it's interesting that I don't think that's crazy. I think that also, if I'm going to back your point, because why the hell not? I would also say that when we've had other natural disasters, enemies do tend to come together. We've had horrible earthquakes in Turkey, and you know who came in to help? The Greeks. I mean, Greeks and Turks hate each other with a passion, hotter than 1,000 suns. Goes back centuries. And sure enough, they came together. And why not with China?
China and Taiwan.
Right, exactly.
If you really want to play the long game, it would be much easier to just make them like you.
What a concept. But
yeah.
yeah.
I mean, it's an obvious one, but it's one.
No. I don't think it is obvious. China is charm offensives seem to be rare, but they can certainly be persuasive.
So I guess the more we talk about this, the more I think, I'm starting to actually back down. It's not that I thought there would be a war. I just think it's a non-zero chance, and that's a non-zero chance of something that would be very bad, which I think we'll get to that in a second or in a few minutes. But it sounds like eventually then the most likely scenario, because let me say this, we agree China is going to try to take Taiwan eventually.
We do.
So let's just clear that conversation out of the way. Me and you are 100% sure they're going to try to. That it's probably something in the distance, and it's probably a slow-moving coup. Do you think then that if they control Taiwan, they would ever really use it in a way as a true weapon to say, hey, no more iPhones and Xboxes and PlayStations this year because we don't like what the U.S. government just did? Or would that hurt them more because of the sanctions we would put back at them? Do they have more power to sanction us because they hold Taiwan in that scenario in the future than we do to really shut them down?
I think that's the $3 trillion question minimum, because there's been a lot of argument that the United States and China can't go to war with each other at all simply because our economies are so interconnected. The Chinese own some incredible percentage of U.S. debt, for example. They just buy bonds. I mean, we're supposedly the most stable economy in the world. And so, we're a great investment for your money. So China buys an enormous number of bonds. And just, look around your house and how much is made by China. But of course, they need that money.
Right.
They're not giving it to us for free. Of course, the people who are selling are dependent on you. It's not just the buyer. So, it would hurt China. Forget about sanctions. It would hurt China tremendously.
Just to stop selling to us. Yeah.
Yeah. It's not like there's an alternative market that compares to the United States. right? I mean, we are the largest economy in the world. We are larger than a bunch of other economies put together. Um,
California is the fifth largest economy in the world, one
I
of our
love
states.
I love that. I love that, statistics. That's fantastic. So yeah, I mean, going to war makes so little sense for both countries.
Hmm.
But it's interesting because the rhetoric is getting hotter and hotter and hotter.
Hmm.
And we've pivoted to Asia. We continue to pivot. My partner Matthew on Angry Planet loves the word pivot, just because it's so ridiculous, and we've been trying to do it for so long, to pivot to Asia, right, and actually focus our attention there. But it's just it doesn't make sense. But you go back to what you've said about World War One, which I think is incredibly perceptive. People said our economies in Europe are so
Right.
interconnected. This could never happen because it would be so terrible for all of us. And yet they managed to kill millions and millions of people. So,
Well, I don't know. There's some quote about the only time you're 100% wrong is when you're 100% sure. And it just seems like everyone's 100% sure there won't be a war. And when I think about, I do a lot of leaks on upcoming Intel, AMD, NVIDIA products. It's kind of what my channel's mostly known for, I think, at this point. My best and most perceptive leaks were the ones that I was 99% sure of or 90% sure of because it made me double check my work 100 times. It's when I'm 100% sure that I sometimes make a wild mistake, which I've been able to avoid for a while now. And that's just my worries that this is the wild mistake a bunch of people are making. It's just, this is probably a good place to pivot then. It seems like we think probably not a war. And if it happened in the future, it's unlikely that it would take a truly ridiculous person, probably not Xi Jinping, frankly, to actually let a trade war happen too, because if they stop selling to us, it hurts them just as much. But let's say that starts going down that path. Authority writes in and he says, I can't help but feel a war would be short-lived. Surely Apple would pay all parties involved for a swift conclusion before their next iPhone releases. And it's a
uh-huh.
joke, but I think it's worth pointing out, when the Ebola crisis in quotes happened, I mean, lots of shipping companies like FedEx donated planes to make that get fixed overnight because they realized, if all they need is this and it'll go away in a month, it's better for our bottom line to literally donate planes. Like some of these companies now are worth trillions. If this were to happen 10 years in the future, I'll promise you some of these companies will be worth $10 trillion. Like, maybe that'll be because the US dollar is worth half as much, but who knows? Let's say that this starts happening. How much power do you think some of these mega corporations that are stronger than most countries now, how much power do you think they could exert on this? Or are they really paper tigers, just big, they have so many zeros at their market cap, but really they just would, because there's a lot of these companies where you could see them going, well, that was a $10 trillion company. Guess they don't exist now. In
Yeah.
the repercussions of that.
Well, companies, I think, are often the subject of conspiracy theories that
Mm-hmm.
companies
They
secretly
are.
control, right? I mean, companies secretly control the world. Multinationals, if you read science fiction,
Mm-hmm.
which I do, multinationals are often what's
Yeah.
really behind the power, and
Like in
governments even
Blade
fall to
Runner,
the side.
it's
Blade
all mega
Runner,
corporations, or I
yeah,
think even the Deus Ex games. There's a lot of science fiction
yeah,
stuff where
yeah,
that's
yeah.
the thing.
I mean, William Gibson, I mean, is really big on that in the earlier works. So, long story short, with that, I think that corporations can lobby, and I think that, but I don't see Tim Cook, secretly. I mean, he could
Threatening
whisper
to
and
do anything, really.
yeah. Well, I mean, in a military conflict, I think what happens to them is that they get brought into it on our side by the US saying, we need more iPhones, or we
Mm-hmm.
need you to do this. We need you to make, for example, the pandemic, right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, we actually turned to companies and said, make ventilators. And some
Mm-hmm.
really weird companies make ventilators now. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, companies that have just no idea, would have had no idea how to do it. I honestly think that's still the way companies get involved more than anything else.
At government's discretion, not the other way around. I mean, I think you can imagine Tim Cook like maybe having Apple fund some campaign for a president more if they think another president is more likely to go to war with Taiwan. But once it actually happens, you don't think they're not gonna do anything about it.
Not yet. I mean, I would say that maybe, there'll be large corporate armies in the future and governments really will wither away. But at the moment,
we're not even 1% there, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Well, so to put a pin, I think, in this part of the conversation, then, like, I just want to kind of tie this up before we get to like the repercussions of a hypothetical scenario. You don't think a war is going to happen then? Yes or no? Because we agree they're going to try to take Taiwan. So what do we think is going to happen?
I think that there would be massive sanctions that would hurt everybody involved, including the United States. It's one thing to put sanctions on Iraq or even Russia, because Russia, all they have is oil and gas, and that has caused problems for our allies. But it's another thing entirely to do it to China, just in terms of the pain we would suffer. But no, I actually think that right now the U.S. is in a mode of walking away from allies. I really think that. I think that what we saw in Afghanistan was horrific. Not necessarily that we should have stayed forever or anything like that, but it's just the way the exit was handled. I just don't know who we're actually there for anymore, other than us.
So what is your point by bringing that up, though, with regards to Taiwan?
I think that if it really push came to shove, that we're not ready to, that they are another ally. It's not even a formal ally. And I don't think we'd be there for them. I think that right now, our own peace and security and our overwhelming happiness at not being at war, I think that massively outweighs what value Taiwan has. Because I'm going to bet you anything the Chinese will still sell us chips. I mean, they'll sell us Taiwanese chips.
So it sounds like you think they're going to go for Taiwan. They're going to successfully take it, and prices are going to go up because China will up prices because they control it now. They'll just have more, or at the very least, China will just have more, I don't know, diplomatic power to threaten us about things. And that's that, but it probably won't ever break out into the worst case scenarios.
That's what I think. But the motives behind it are interesting. And it makes you wonder what happens if Turkey is attacked next and NATO allies. I just
but we don't get along with Turkey that great now. So you could almost go, that's a good example of who knows what we would do.
Yeah. Donald Trump, not to say one way or another whether it was a good thing, but he really questioned Article 50 of the NATO Charter, which is that one power comes to the aid of another NATO treaty ally, no matter what. And if we're even willing to talk about that with a NATO ally, I think it's Article 5, by the way. If we're able to do that, then how much more are we willing to let Taiwan sink into the sea, so to speak?
Well, let me ask you this, actually, then. So, again, just to summarize, make sure I'm not off base here. We both agree China's going to go for Taiwan. You believe that to some degree China will be successful because we're not going to do anything about it. But the reason we probably won't do anything about it is it's not like China's going to stop selling us chips anyways, because they need us to buy them just as much as we need them to sell them. Do you think that's going to be fine then? Like, obviously, I don't think either of us think a military conflict would be good. Do you think that the West, let's say, or even just the rest of the world, because I say the West and that what we're basically including South Korea, Vietnam, Japan, do you think the rest of the world should let them, though, even if that's what you think's going to happen? I guess we agree we don't want a war, but what do you think the rest of the world should do? Or do you think the best outcome is China taking Taiwan and us looking the other way? Is it the lesser of all evils? And are you funded by the Chinese government? I'm just
That's
kidding.
right. That's right. God, I really don't know. I think, but I don't think I'm alone in not knowing.
Sure.
I think that there's a part of me that's, a strong believer that the U.S. should keep its word and that it's important for the United States to be a major power in the world outside of the United States' borders. I do believe that the United States has interests that are outside of the continental United States. And part of me almost longs for the old stability of an American empire. I mean, it's nice to have an empire when you're the ones who have it, right? But
keep in mind, when our empire was at its height, though, the CIA was kind of having a real circus. They literally had, I think, didn't they have an operation over Tibet? It's called something flying circus. They had all these.
Yes.
So
yes.
let's be fair. When we weren't being challenged, we were doing some crazy stuff to our own people a little bit.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So I don't want to see war. I do think that a strong United States is a benefit to the United States and maybe even to the world. I don't actually think we're as evil as a lot of people do. I really don't.
It's all relative. I would certainly agree. I'll just say.
Yeah. But I do think that in some senses, America is genuinely in decline. Mm-hmm. I think that there is a withdrawing from the world, an isolationism that is growing. And it doesn't mean that America is necessarily in permanent decline or at all. Mm-hmm. We've had these
You're saying we're in decline. It doesn't mean it will always be a downward trend.
Right, exactly. We pulled back from the world at the end of World War I. We didn't want to get involved in World War I at all. Isolationism became one of the most powerful forces. We didn't actually get into World War II. Now we look back at World War II.
Yeah, it looks also inevitable, but back then people were probably like, oh, no, this is the end of us ever bothering anything.
Yeah, September of 1939 is when the war started, when Germany invaded Poland. We get involved December 7th, 1941.
We like to be fashionably late to world wars.
Right. Isolationism has often been a strong force in the United States, and I just feel like that's where we are now. I have no idea what the future holds. There's nothing inherently crappy about the United States that makes it so that we'll only decline and disappear. I don't think that at all, but I do think right now that's where our mindset is, to pull back.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, just to try to force you to answer the question then, do you think the lesser of two evils is letting China take Taiwan and just exert more power over the world? Or do you think that outside countries, including, again, Vietnam, South Korea and such, is it in their best interest to not let them do it, even if it caused a limited engagement, even if it caused shortages for a few years? Or do you think it would be in the best interest of everyone if we just kind of let them take it and keep moving on?
I think that it would probably not be in our best interest to just let them take it, because I do believe they will continue to take things. Right. And at some point, we do have to stand up for what will become our direct interests. Mm-hmm. I mean, whether Taiwan, and I think your show, I mean, it's all about how Taiwan is a direct interest of the United States. But even if you said it wasn't, the next thing will be. Mm-hmm. And I think that at some point, the United States will have to stand up before a world gets potentially gobbled up. But I'm scared of the prospect. And also, I am not entirely sure in what way the United States wins.
Right. It sounds like you're saying it's a lesser of two evils to let China take Taiwan, but it's not the best outcome. It's certainly better than a world war, but it's not the best outcome. But you're not sure what the best outcome is. The best outcome is, in your opinion, some degree of not letting them completely take it, but you don't know what that would be.
Well, the question is, how far do we let China go? And is it up to the United States? Are we the responsible party? And I guess I do feel like I'm enough of a child of the Cold War to believe that, yes, the United States does have a responsibility to keep China from becoming the world. I don't love the Chinese system of autocracy.
There's a lot
wouldn't
of
want,
people in Western China that agree with you right now.
yeah, at least 1 million. I mean that's been acknowledged as genocide. What's happened to the Uyghurs?
Hmm.
Um, uh, just to tell your users something, I'm Jewish.
Hmm.
Historically, people haven't been all that fond of Jews,
I've
authoritarian
noticed that.
governments.
Yeah, I've
Yeah.
noticed that.
So, I think there's enough recent history that to make China genuinely scary as an overlord. I mean,
Because
really
they've proven
terrifying.
they'll act in scary ways towards groups of people already. So if they took, hey, what if they wanted to take back Vietnam? Who knows? What if they want South
Totally.
Korea? I don't know. This is not something that would happen within the next decade, but within the next 100 years, if they were allowed to keep going, or I don't know.
Can I recommend a series of books?
No. Yeah, of
All right.
course.
Well, then I won't. No, it's a science fiction series by a guy named David Wingrove. You'll have never heard of it, but it's actually tells this story.
Mm.
What if China took over the world?
Hmm.
And it's very sophisticated telling. It goes on over 7 books. There's so much thought that went into exactly how this would happen and what Chinese would govern like. I really recommend the books in case you really want to see this through and think
Hmm.
it through. Because David Wingrove did the job for you.
Well, I'll put that link in the description. The next thing I want to bring up then is a question from JJ Golden. He says, Jason and Tom, bottom line, what does China gain from Taiwan and how much are they willing to lose? I'm a pessimist and think a US-Sino war is inevitable. Obviously, the island of Taiwan goes back to ROC forces following World War II, and even earlier with the Qing Dynasty defeat and Japanese occupation. But it's 2021 right now, not 1912. What's the point? Is it economic security, diplomatic power, or something else that makes China want Taiwan? And this gets into my La La Land thing of like, I feel like there's some La La Land going on in China of like, things are going pretty well right now for the Chinese government. Why bother?
Why are they doing all this? It's such a good question, but it's not just happening in Taiwan. The South China Sea, they are building islands in the South China
Mm.
Sea to exert their power over the Philippines, over Vietnam, over,
Hmm.
I mean, this is clearly something they want to do. China wants it to be the Chinese century in the same way that it was the American
Hmm.
century,
Yeah, they've said this publicly. Yeah.
right? I mean, so I think it's important to the national identity. I think it's important to give people something when you're taking away all of their
Everything.
freedom,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it's insane what they're doing right now to their own people. The monitoring, their credit system. Have you ever talked about that on this show?
Yeah, it's the first episode, I believe, of a Black Mirror season.
Yeah, yeah,
It's just like
exactly.
literally, and I've watched a Vice News report on it where they were talking to people in China and they're like, oh, we love that episode. Like they literally said that, yeah, that's our goal. That was a good episode. It was nice, right? And they
Yeah.
saw it as a happy story.
So yeah, I do see that China wants to be. They say they want to be ascendant, and they're doing everything to prove it, and that seems to be motive enough.
That's such a good point, putting it now that we're talking about this, like from the perspective of if has anyone taken a step back and gone, it doesn't make sense from a purely financial sense to do any of this. Like things are going so well at China. They'll have an ascendant 100 years by default if they just act a little nicer and keep making more money. It's a guarantee. And yet they're doing these risky things. The only reason they would do those risky things then is if they really do want to control far more than they do right now.
Or the other option is things are actually more of a Potemkin
Mm,
village in China than we
yeah.
think. Um, have No, I assume you have been reading it all about how China has invested enormously in real estate inside China. They build these
Hmm.
ghost cities.
Yeah.
People take their savings and buy an apartment they never have any intention of living in a city that never existed before.
Well, they
Um,
banned a lot of things you can do on the stock market. You can't own Bitcoin. So if you're going to save up money, you can't really
mhm.
own. I guess you got to buy their own real estate that you're allowed to own, even though that's kind of a weird in a communist country to let them own land. But
Right, right. But that's actually it looks like that's a bit of a shell game,
Oh, yeah.
right? And Evergrande, one of their biggest real estate companies, is in deep, deep trouble. Doesn't look like they'll be able to pay their debts.
Mm.
And with that being the case, a lot of people would lose their shirts. I mean, if there's any group of people that need a distraction, it's people who are suffering financially.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how bad it can get, but it does actually sound like China financially may be in trouble. If that's
I mean, I haven't looked at it recently, but I remember about a year ago reading up on it and going, ooh, I think this is a House of Cards financial one, like a 2008 level, way worse actually than 2008 level crash that could happen there.
Right. And then what do you do? Well, I mean, the old playbook is you then distract everybody by striking outward. We sort of joke on my podcast about the fact that, everything comes back to World War II. But
I was about to bring it up. Go on.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think, hey, I worked at the Holocaust Memorial Museum. I mean, if nobody else thinks it goes back to World War II, it's going to be me. But one of the reasons why the Germans wanted to actually take over other countries, Lebensraum, was economic.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to make sure that they had enough food for everybody. They wanted to make sure that, they made money. They wanted to distract everyone from the fact that everything sucked, because everything did suck.
Yeah.
All of that stuff. By pouring money into the military, it really helped the overall economy. All this kind of stuff. So what does China do if it finds itself in that kind of depression? Because I think we don't understand what the depression was like, the actual depression.
Yeah.
In the 30s, 20s, into the 20s, through the 30s. I don't think we know what that's like.
I mean, my grandparents are actually almost 90, so they were kids during it. And I asked them about the depression, and it's like, oh, we all shared a toothbrush. And it's easy to make that whimsical and ha, 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 how gross. You need to share your toothbrush. But it's like, no, think about it. What if you had to share a toothbrush with 10 people? What would make you do that? How bad would it have been that you couldn't afford a $1 toothbrush?
Yeah, that's exactly. And people starved in the United States. I mean, a place where, agriculturally, the United States is a very lucky place.
Oh, yeah. We feed multiple countries. We feed the world, basically.
I mean, we have so much arable land, and we are really, really lucky. And so if people are starving here, something is really messed up.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
you're saying
systemically.
Yeah, and you're saying because we don't. They have a wall around a lot of the info that comes out of. I think a lot of people, too, see what's going on. Like, oh, well, we have this investigative reporting on China's ghost cities, so we know that's happening. We know this is happening. The more I look at it, it seems like we have good reporting from leaks and people who really put their neck out on what's going on in eastern China. We don't really know much about what goes on in central or western China. There's so many cities. I mean, I remember when COVID started, people were like, oh, it came from Wuhan. And it's like, what's that? And I Googled it. Oh, a city that's as big as New York or something. I've never even heard of it. There's so much that's going on there that we don't know. Yeah. So you're suggesting that the reason they're doing this is because they might need to. Because of eventually it could get pretty bad there.
Yeah. To me, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's the simplest explanation.
Right. And by Occam's razor, we know that it must be true.
Mm-hmm. Well, it has to be, right? Yeah.
It has to be, right.
Well, one of the final kind of things I want to start talking about then is I'm proud to say that Moore's Law is Dead is sponsored by eWin Gaming Chairs. eWin makes dozens of customizable chairs for you. These chairs aren't just built for short-term comfort, they are built for long-term support, whether working or gaming. I didn't rush to make this ad. I actually gave it a bit of time to evaluate, and I can honestly say it's very comfortable, and assembly isn't that bad. Support Moore's Law is Dead and support your back by clicking the link in the description. And don't forget to use the code BROKENSILICON to save 20% on your order. I can fully recommend these chairs, and at least recently now, has a nice one to sit on in future ads, but not as nice as mine. Buy Ewin Racing gaming chairs today. Well, let me just bring up this reader mail from Timo. He says, as I've learned, Russia wants to keep production domestic. China has SMIC for semiconductors, which despite plentiful funding doesn't seem to be very good at making CPUs so far. And Intel has fabs and assembly and other things all over the world. So would the West get along without TSMC and Taiwan if it needed to? What would it mean to other continents? Let's also add earthquakes and tsunamis as example for unexpected situations endangering an already brittle chain of semiconductors. Which one is more likely? And I think this is where it gets into an interesting discussion whether it involves China or not. What if a truly catastrophic earthquake happened and Taiwan was just, I would say, knocked out of the game for a few years? I mean, I've got my own opinions. Like, how bad? What picture would you paint? Like, because I think everyone says it would be the end of the world. It's like it wouldn't be, but it would suck.
Yeah, I'd make a comparison to oil, actually. Both are commodities, but the United States, it doesn't matter whether you buy oil from Iraq or OPEC countries at all. What matters is that somebody in the chain does, right? So, in other words, because you need a certain supply overall, whether or not you buy it from that supplier. So the U.S. can create enough oil for itself, right? But China buys its oil from OPEC. Take away OPEC, and prices in the United States will go up.
Yeah.
Right? Even though we are not buying that supply directly.
Because there's a lot that goes into like global oil that I think people don't understand. Like we actually, I think, produce most of the oil we use in the US.
Yeah.
Like it's not like when people say there's a war for oil, it's not like, no, we're not gonna run out. It's just everything's made of plastic now too. And oil is used to make that. It's just things have just become so much more expensive.
Yeah. I mean, and there does get to a point where people literally won't be able to afford it. And you'd have rationing and
everything's shipped using oil still.
Everything's shipped using oil. So anyway, to use that as an analogy, let's say we never bought another microchip from Taiwan. Let's say we were able to source them elsewhere. Well, we would source them at so much of a higher price because the overall number of chips is lower. So just market forces, no matter what, will, they take effect and the prices become so high that there's rationing. That's how you handle a situation like that. So, you can't buy a new car. You have to be able to show a need to buy a new car.
And during World War II, again, this isn't unfathomable, people. Less than 100 years ago, I think they said they just made tanks. I think not a new car was produced for about 3 years or something in the U.S.
Things like tires and they had these ration coupons, which I really recommend you watch Bugs Bunny.
Because
a
lot of old cartoons actually will have something really weird where you're like, whoa, what's that?
Yeah, one of my favorites is actually that a bomber with bugs in it is going straight down. And it's an uncontrolled dive, and everybody's about to die. And it stops less than a foot above the ground. And the reason is that, that's what you get with these A cards. That means it ran out of gas because an A card would only get you in a certain amount of gas. Everyone who watched it would have laughed their asses off. To us, that joke is totally lost.
Funny now that I understand the joke, by the way. That is pretty funny.
Yeah. I mean, so, it's totally lost on us. But it just shows there was rationing before. There was rationing of food and everything else in the UK after World War II. We don't know what it's like to live like that. We only know about scarcity to the point of where it's like so expensive to buy a new car, or people are actually taking homes. Sorry, go ahead.
No, or at the grocery store. I remember during the first outbreaks of COVID, my brother drove down from Boston and stayed with me in Peoria, Illinois. And so we went to the grocery store there, Hy-Vee, and it was just like, they're out of chicken thighs. Guess we'll eat breasts. Like it wasn't that bad, guys. It really wasn't that bad.
No, you have the problem with toilet paper, which, by the way, is scarce again.
Yeah.
But scarce is not non-existent. There's panic buying again. It's These are false scarcities in a lot of ways. This is not what you would be dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
That in a way that the oil supply was genuinely interrupted, the chip supply was genuinely interrupted. This would be much worse, honestly, than it is
Mm-hmm.
now.
Yeah, and I'll bring in another reader mail. B-Fish writes in and says, let's assume China bombs Taiwan, or I think, well, we're past. Let's just assume TSMC is completely destroyed. From a purely supply chain standpoint, though, I'm guessing their volume could be somewhat absorbed by Samsung, Intel, Global Foundries. I know a lot of items are assembled in China, though, and the production could possibly be sent somewhere like Vietnam. It seems to me like things would become delayed, more expensive, and it would handicap certain firms more than others. Is there anything we get from Taiwan that is absolutely irreplaceable? And my answer is immediately yes, but long answer no. I mean, right now, AMD, and I don't know if you know this, Jason, but like TSMC is just so ahead in semiconductor technology right now. It's not even, it basically goes them, and then a tier below that is Samsung, and then Intel, and then Global Foundries is below those. So it's like it right. Let me put it in perspective. The new iPhone, I'm told, actually has some sort of pseudo early 4 nanometer. It's marketed as 5 nanometer, but the point is they're making chips on that now that my processor is like half the capability. So if they were to make my graphics card at the node Apple has access to, it would probably just be straight up 50% better. If we were in my my processors made it an inferior TSMC node. So if TSMC was knocked out of the game now, I mean the alternatives would be, I think what you would see is there'd be a year of you couldn't get almost any computer, like a year of PlayStation and Xbox going, I guess we're going to port more games to last gen because no one can buy PS5s right now. And then after that, there'd be a year of AMD making their latest stuff actually at like Global Foundries, maybe even Intel, if people can believe it. And all of that stuff would be double the price and half and use double the energy compared to what it would be if it was at TSMC. And then 2 years after that, things would start to get better. But I think we'd have like a 5 year slowdown in technological progression, honestly, and just years of not being able to buy anything.
Yeah, I actually have a question for you along that line.
Mm.
When you're talking about these chips, I mean, my not just my television, but my refrigerator has, semiconductors, microprocessors. It's got everything you want. Would I not be able to buy a refrigerator? I mean, I can use my old computer, but if my refrigerator dies, it dies.
As far as I can tell, TSMC is about almost 30% of the world's market share. So we have to remember is they make a lot of the most cutting edge stuff. Again, the cutting edge right now is like 5 nanometer class products. And then behind that 7 nanometer, that's what the Xbox is made with, 7 nanometer, which is 30-40% worse. And then after that, it's mostly 16 and 12 nanometer. Try to think of what is on that class. Still a lot of stuff you buy, but most of it's actually 28 nanometer or worse, like stuff that the PS3 was made on, like 90 nanometer, that type of stuff. That type of stuff is like 50% of the world's production. So I think most refrigerators probably don't use cutting edge nodes. They have no reason to. And usually the processors cars use are, like I said, so if it goes 5 nanometer, 7, then 16. Most cars, I think, still use 12, 16 nanometer. So that would be affected. Cars would be wildly affected. All computers obviously would be wildly affected. There's only so much. To put things in perspective for this reader mail question that I just went over, Samsung's 10% of the production, and then Global Foundries is 7. So they're not absorbing. They're combined. They're half as big as TSMC. So they're not absorbing TSMC. I really think just because a fourth of all world production is gone, you would have mass shortages with anything that needs a component, but that it would be more effective the more advanced it is, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
I think for half a year, everything would kind of stop being produced. Yeah.
So that doesn't sound good. And
No.
it so does that make war more likely or less? That's actually an interesting question because I think anyone who's doing the wargaming will know what you just said. And are we going to bomb Taiwan knowing that we'll be destroying, let's say the Chinese troops get there, then we have to bomb them and all this wonderful stuff. It's possible we could destroy TSMC, right? But the Chinese could destroy it. It's bad for everyone. It just seems like, wow, just that one company is enough to avoid war.
Which is why I think this is an interesting discussion without even bringing war into it, because it's worth talking about just how disruptive this would be if it was an earthquake, and it kind of gets me to Carbon Cry writes in, and he says, I see the prevention of conflict as far more important than mitigating the impacts of a possible conflict. Given this outlook, the U.S. move to bolster domestic leading-edge foundry capacity and thus decrease the dependence on ROC-based foundries like the TSMC, UMC, is the wrong move, in my opinion. If the U.S. are dependent on ROC semiconductor manufacturing, does that not, in the eyes of PRC strategists, increase U.S. commitment to support them if a conflict would break out? It is especially dangerous, methinks, as U.S. domestic production can never suffice for the world, the West, or even for the U.S. What are your thoughts on this? As the U.S.'s move towards silicon independence paradoxically increased the fragility of leading-edge silicon supply for the world and the U.S. itself.
That's
he puts
mouthful.
a lot of thoughts. I know he puts a lot of thoughts into his questions.
So it does seem like it's a good reason to avoid war, right? I mean, but when we get then back to the sanctions issue, let's say, wouldn't we have to ban anything coming from China? Do we make an exception for the superconductors? Or I'm sorry, not superconductors, but semiconductors.
Semiconductors, yeah.
Right. Do we make an exception for that? It just seems like, war is just, it's so funny. Having this conversation with you has made me think about something aside from, just the cheap little objects that I have from China, or the fact that my clothes were all made in China, or all that.
Because it's not
stuff.
just the cheap stuff anymore. It's the most expensive stuff, actually, we need from them.
Yeah, exactly. So does make war sound even less likely to me, even if China does take over Taiwan. And what you're saying about earthquake does sound like it would be devastating. It seems like there should be some sort of global policy for redundancy. Doesn't it? Doesn't seem like there should be some consortium or something that says that, chips cannot be made in only one location.
I mean, it's a good point. The problem is it turns into state, company secrets. Like TSMC's very happy with the money they're making, with the fact that they've been able to, and it was hard work. The R&D they did, the engineers toiled to get them to the cutting edge. I think Intel could catch up to them in 5 years, but it's a while, of just one company really making stuff that if you made it at another person's fab would use double the energy,
So use economic incentives to have them build a plant in the United States.
Which they are. They're building in Arizona now, and it won't be ready till 2024. And that's one fab out of 20 or so,
So if only the war waits until 2024, or no earthquake comes till 2024, we're good.
Yeah, it sounds like I would say it sounds like you disagree with him, and I do too, that it's not even about war, that we need to build more stuff in the U.S., not even just for ourselves, but so we can build stuff for Mexico. Mexico should probably have its own fabs. Everyone should probably be trying to get TSMC and Samsung, who makes pretty cutting edge stuff too, fabs in other places, because this just, especially with, expected, more superstorms coming from climate change and stuff, it's just ridiculous to have everything in one area anymore. Like, I don't think anyone planned this to happen, that there'd be one company out of nowhere in a geopolitical tense situation on an earthquake fault line that everything depends on. It just kind of happened.
Yeah, you're totally right. And when we're talking about semiconductors, there are also just a million other products. I think we should remind people that also are made in one location or another. You know, let's just say that TV manufacturing was taken out in
Hmm.
in South Korea, for example.
Right. They make the panels for a lot of companies.
Right? I mean, so even if it's not quite as high tech but you can't get a TV in Europe. I mean, you wouldn't be able to. You wouldn't be able to get one in the United States. We are so both distributed and concentrated. Things are made often in one location but we are distributed in that we are anticipating that everyone will be able to take from that one location and spread it all over
Hmm.
the world, right? I mean, it's just the interconnectedness that everyone's now been talking about forever. Uh, I don't, it just seems like the consequences of a big enough disaster are more dire than people are thinking about.
Hmm.
I mean, just in terms of real world consequences. Um, all of the stuff that we take for granted, all the stuff that we enjoy using, the most high tech stuff seems like, yeah, I mean, you've got choke points and threats.
Hmm. Which, again, just to reiterate, I kind of my main point talking about this is I just think people need to be ready that nothing is ever actually the end of the world. World War One
True,
wasn't the
true.
end of the world. World War Two wasn't the end of the world. If an earthquake swallowed Taiwan, if some war broke out over Taiwan and they couldn't make anything for a year, it wouldn't be the end of the world, but it would be 1 year of, well, I guess that's how many PlayStation 5s, iPhones, and Xboxes exist. We can't really do anything about it. You can't buy any new
Yeah.
phones. And because of that, also, you can't buy most new cars. And also, it's hard to get a refrigerator even now. And then in a year after that, it's, oh, we're making new stuff. This is the new PS5 Victory Edition. It's made in the United States. It uses double the energy and heats up your whole room, and it costs twice as much, but it's made in the USA. And then I think 2 years after that is when things would start coming back to normal. But it really wouldn't be back to normal for 6 years. It would just be complete disruption of like, what's the next Zen or Intel processor to come out.
Mhm.
But we would get there. It would just be a crappy few years. And I think it'd be a lot of like when it comes to video game companies of, well, it looks like we're going to have to make do with weaker hardware for this next game.
Well, let me ask you though. I mean, when we take out any of these things, if we take out the high-end processors, we take out okay, we don't have cars, we don't have doesn't it have knockback effects on the rest of the economy too?
Oh yeah, it'd be worse than the oil shortages in the 70s with the food shortages of whatever combined. Yeah, yeah. I mean, and and it's funny though. We talk about this like, okay, we wait until 2024 and then things wouldn't be as bad. It's like, well, I think it's all relative. At Intel's new innovation event, they were showing how they're building these like six-wheel human-sized delivery FedEx machines that run on their new 10 nanometer Tiger Lake processors. I think those are made in the US, so that's good news. But like what happens when like all mail is delivered by machines and we can't make new machines to deliver mail? So you're saying it'd be better in 5 or 10 years. I'm not so sure if everything uses silicon then.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Well,
everything will use silicon then. It doesn't actually
right.
now. There's still a mailman.
Well, so I'm now going to do a very quick advertisement for the subscription tier of Angry Planet because we actually just did an episode that I'm going to put out today on pretty much exactly this. If people have read Foundation or they're watching on TV as it comes out on Apple, Isaac Asimov's classic, the whole basis of Foundation is technology that people can't replace. The empire falls because the understanding of the technology that people have, people just don't, the technical expertise is gone. The
Mm.
source and supplies of a lot of this technology is gone. And things start to just crumble. Finally, the empire itself entirely crumbles. So,
Rome hires German soldiers and doesn't even have its own military anymore.
yeah, exactly. So, um, it doesn't seem crazy that that could happen, but none of it has. I'm going to
Mhm.
actually be optimistic for a second, which I never am. But we've had so many disasters that we've expected over the last 50 years. And things don't tend to ever get quite as bad as we think.
No,
Every generation thinks that they live at the end of the world.
they do. And people need to remember that. I mean, my God. And my mom talks about she grew up in the Cold War as well. She's like, no, we thought there could be a nuclear war, you know?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
I guess
I
the
couldn't
exception
sleep.
is the 90s. The 90s, for some reason, they called it the end of history. That's like the one decade where, for some reason, humans got it in this head. Not only is it not the end of the world, but everything will always be perfect, and we can just, go to a concert or something.
Yeah, yeah, it's true. Well, I mean, things looked pretty good there for a little while. They
Hmm.
really did. I can tell you, from a person who was a full adult at the time and actually owned a piece of the Berlin Wall because they were selling them. And I thought this
Of
would be a very
course.
cool thing to own.
What
So,
by the way, to any Russians listening, which we do, they would say, what an American thing to sell pieces of the Berlin Wall. Thank you
exactly
so
right.
much. Yeah.
Exactly right. Yeah, anything to make a buck. But yeah, those were heady times there for a little while. But realpolitik reasserted itself.
Hmm. And I guess if there was one thing to close on too, then I would say that I don't think things are ever going to be as bad as we think they will. And in fact, it's just so important to remind people that from the perspective of a world leader in the 1800s, we've accomplished everything. Like, I think in 1900, the literacy rate in the United States was, I believe, 15-20%. And I think the extreme poverty rate in the United States in the 1800s was 90%. So that means 90% extreme poverty is defined internationally typically as not having enough food or shelter or water or security. One of those you don't have, you're in extreme poverty. Maybe you have water and a place to live, you don't have food. Maybe you have food, but you're homeless. That's considered extreme poverty. 90% of the US was extreme poverty before 1900. And now it's like 5 or 10%. I don't even think, yeah, it's gotta be like 5% at most. So I would say that from the perspective of a world leader in the 1800s, we have world peace. We have world hunger has been solved. They would say 95%, that's an A. What are you talking about? We were at 10% 100 years ago. I think from the perspective of previous generations, things are great. But then people also need to understand they're never going to be perfect, and you're always going to have to do hard work. There's never going to be a point where it's like, well, we made this system, we can walk away. We're going to have to always do something about something.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that unfortunately, the down note here, and that, by the way, that's the name of our newsletter, the down note, is that, if you are one of those people in the 10%, it sucks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. and that it shouldn't be acceptable, though. Because
Yes,
again, from
exactly.
an old steel baron's perspective, he would say, I was mad when my workers wanted more than a meal a day, and now they have three. What are you guys even complaining about anymore? But you know, it's still not acceptable to have, some of those things going on that could be made better. All right. Well, I think I have a few other reader mails, but I think really this is a good place to close it on. I think we pretty much hit how bad a shortage would be adequately and what we think could happen. I really want to thank you for coming on, Jason. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I'll let you once again plug as many things as you want. I know there's at least one thing you're a part of that I can't recommend enough.
Well, thank you very much. Hey, look, it was great to come on and talk about this stuff. I appreciate the fact that you tried to nail me down when I tried to squirm. Not everybody does that, and I think that's great. Uh, yeah, so we have Angry Planet, the podcast. We have a newsletter. We have a subscription tier. And I also wrote a novel about the Holocaust a few years ago, which I think everyone might enjoy if you can enjoy a book about the Holocaust.
Well, I mean, not to be a jerk, but you're assuming they can, or you wouldn't have wrote it.
Yeah.
As an American capitalist that you are.
That's right. Well, yeah, unfortunately, I was wrong about that. But it's called Death in Twilight. And if you want to make
Okay.
my day, buy one copy. If you really want to make my week, buy 10.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'll put that in the description as well. Thank you for coming on, Jason, and thank you to everybody for listening.
Thank you very much.
This podcast was brought to you by the YouTube channel and website Moore's Law is Dead. Moore's Law is Dead and Broken Silicon are trademarks of their creator, Tom. That guy is me, and I am indeed the creator, editor, writer, and showrunner of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, videos, articles, and other media. However, I don't do this alone. Moore's Law is Dead is a team, with Broken Silicon co-hosted by my brother, Dan, audio editing by Gerard Cortez, and special assistance by Carbon Cry. Find all of our information, including the information of sponsors you can support, at www.mooreslawsdead.com. If you would like to send fan mail or hardware to us, please mail parcels to Moore's Law is Dead at P.O. Box 60632 in Nashville, Tennessee, zip code 37206. And speaking of fans, patrons are what makes Moore's Law is Dead content possible. The aging business model of spamming ads all over the content is dying. The future of media will be built on fans paying for the content they actually want to exist. And so if you have the extra money, but only if you do, please consider supporting us. For just $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive podcast Die Shrink, voting on subjects of future podcast episodes, the ability to have your questions read aloud on Broken Silicon, Die Shrink, and Loose Ends, and of course, access to the Moore's Law is Dead Discord full of like-minded people who would love to meet you and talk to you about computer hardware. I am one of them. Additionally, higher tiers get access to ad-free episodes of Broken Silicon, the entire back catalog of Flyover States podcasts and other projects Moore's Law is Dead has done, and thanks in the credits of videos and other perks as well. And hey, if you can't afford to support us, please do share Moore's Law is Dead videos and podcasts with friends and family on social media, Reddit, and forums. And give Broken Silicon a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or your preferred podcast app. All of this really does help so much. And if you'd like to advertise on the podcast, hire Tom for consulting, or are a person of interest who would like to be a guest, please reach out to the email address mlhbdead@gmail.com. But as I said, this podcast would not be possible without its patrons supporting it, and so now it is time to give a personal thanks to the greatest of the fans. The following supporters are at the 10 gigahertz or higher producer levels: Brad Mellon, Telos, GUK, Benny Berlin, Justin Yant, Thomas Rupp, I Love You, Lina Jim, Ivan K, Tom Bailey, Muhammad Al-Kawari, Frederick Lau, Metrocore, Justin Pear, Zachary Martin, Terrence Harrod, Drita Full, Phil S, D31337 Antics, The Ninth Duke, Jesse Kowiak, Josh Law, JBG, Travis Gooding, The Mechanical Philosopher, Libo King Kilo, Fatboy Deeseru, Daniel Hyde, A Guy in PA81, Nathan Mose, Cole Addict, Matt Salem, Aaron Close, F7GOS, Matthew Landavazo, My Name is Nobody, Judson N. Alethros, Jensen Wang, Hey There's a Kitty, Greg T. Wanchek, Ivan214, John Jameson, Sam Venzel, Matthew Lane, Mark Raidmaker, Jan Rauner, Chris Licato, Michael McGee, Ali Robertson, Eric Jackson, Jonathan, Patrick Groh, Evan Dingle, Dominique Cox, Stephen Ross, Original Ross, Anthony Garefa, Joaquin Hagan, Total Silo, Sol Connor, Michael Casa, Andrew S. C. Jitz, Aaron Keith, Gregory S. Acker, Endless Loggins, Tom Sanfilippo, Justice Brennan, Zootsu Taylor, Trevor Power Stew, Alenia Nanan, Daniel Nishbal, Franco Frederic, Dane Galanowski, Ian Clifford, Axel Cisneros, Leighton Perry, Joseph Kerman, Brett Summers, Blake, Donovan Russell, Noah Nicoella, Zlicky, Martin Porshegi, David Cowden, Ricky Tan, Hulam, Patrick J.S., Justin Staples, Freddie Canoas Jr., Stephen Coates, Kiwi Phil, Brucha, Jeremy So, Michelle Pell, Brett Summers, Eddie Del Castillo, Joseph Loria, Luis Correa, Deke, Cheesy Ramen, Tyler Lindley, Tim Robbins, Jake Dude 23, Brian Riggleman, Justin Gower, Caillou Markelli, Dave McCoy, Valco Malev, Gabe Langner, Rodney Kaluk, Souza, Michael Deaton, MJB1, Maurice Courtois, Wesley Sager, Sarcastro, Mai Sharono, Y. Troy, Roman, William W. Draper, Air Rats, Wakir Khan, Henry Zhang, Stephen Hart, Christopher A. Butler, Greg, Peter Moore, Amiable Chief, Justin Thomas, Sam Miller, Semi Malas, James Anderson, Shakir, Nick Rakin, Holden Mobley, Matthew Lazier, Arpit Sharma, Meat and Pork, Jimmy NG, Mads, Gordon Freeman, Benjamin Oshley, Mark Mitchell with Shield TV, Udo, Aaron, John Wisink, and of course, thank you to Sahara for the music.